So it's nice to see everyone. I'm Matt Plen, the Chief Executive of Masorti Judaism. Nice to see you all. I know some of you and not others, so it's nice to meet the ones I don't know and nice to see the ones that I do know. And I'll be running the session tonight with Rabbi Roni, who I think you all know. And this is Martha, who also works for us as our comms manager at Masorti Judaism. Does everyone else, should we just quickly do names? Why not, if we're a small group? Why don't we just quickly introduce ourselves, name and something about us. If you've got anything, Claire, go ahead.
Oh, I'm Claire. What kind of thing about us? That's a too vague question.
I don't know, pick a fact. What? Something you did today.
And something I did today, I have just cooked dinner from the Green Roasting Tin, which is my new favourite cookbook.
Very nice, thank you. I'm going to have to guess, is it Gerudin? I'm guessing, I apologise to guess the pronunciation of your name. I think you're on, there you should be able to unmute.
No, that's spot on. You're one of the first people ever to get it right.
Ah, that's nice to know, thank you, good.
Well, it's nice to get someone to get it right. No, I'm just making some little wall hanging things out of wood.
Ah, very nice.
That's what I've been doing today.
Great, very nice. Thank you. Nice to meet you then. Barney, would you like to tell us something you've been up to?
Oh, well, yep, I'm Barney, and I am really intrigued by the title of this. I work in the media, so I'm fascinated by the idea of the concept that there is such a thing as culture wars going on, and we all know about the existence of echo chambers too. So I'm completely fascinated. That's the thing about me.
Thank you, Barney. And I think we still have is Sarah still there? I can't quite see. I don't know if
yep, I'm still here. Still walking home from work. My fun fact of my day is I've just done 12 hours of work. Nothing else has happened.
Ah, well, thank you for your service.
Oh yes, sexual health is important.
Very good. And I see Karen's just joined us. So Karen, we just did some quick introductions, so we can see that you're there, Karen. Nice to see you. And I think we're going to get going. So here's what we're going to do. So this is our last Masorti Thinks session, and this is on the culture wars. We entitled it "Culture Wars, Echo Chambers, and mahloket leshet shamayim," which means debates for the sake of heaven. So I'm just gonna open up for about 10 minutes, and what I want to do is talk about one of the core historical principles of Masorti Judaism, and then explain why that principle has become problematic in the context of what's become known as the culture wars. And the thing I want to introduce this by talking about is the Jacobs affair. So some of us will be familiar with the Jacobs affair, but the Jacobs affair was a series of events that took place surrounding Rabbi Dr Louis Jacobs, who is known as the founder of, or the spiritual founder, I suppose, of Masorti Judaism in the UK. And the story starts. And Rabbi Louis Jacobs, you know, some of you might be familiar with his work and teachings, but I'm going to tell his story as he presents it in his book Beyond Reasonable Doubt, which was kind of a retrospective of his life and thoughts, which he wrote towards the end of his life. He died in the early 2000s, I think, the mid 2000s. So Rabbi Louis Jacobs, in this book Beyond Reasonable Doubt, talks about the fact that he grew up in he was an Orthodox rabbi, and he grew up in a tradition of what he calls kind of moderate Anglo-Orthodox. The moderate Anglo-Orthodox rabbinate, and he said that group of people, those rabbis, combined very naturally academic Bible scholarship, you know, critical academic Bible scholarship, with traditional observance as a matter of course. And it was no surprise to anyone that you would be frum and you would observe Shabbat and so on, and at the same time you would study the Bible using academic tools and be free to say and think what you liked about it, as long as you were observant, and the two things went together very naturally. And in 1957, Rabbi Jacobs published a book called We Have Reason to Believe, and it was a book of kind of popular theology, still worth a read. Actually, it's a very good book. We Have Reason to Believe, And he went through various issues of Jewish theology, and he tried to kind of explain the rational basis of many Jewish beliefs. And one of the chapters was about the origins of the Torah. And as he'd always taught, he discussed whether the Torah comes from heaven, is it divinely revealed, what's the evidence for and against, is there evidence for human authorship? And in the normal course of events, he discussed those topics as he normally would have done in his classes that he gave. So Louis Jacobs was then appointed, he was the rabbi of a synagogue called the New West End Synagogue, which still exists in London. And he was appointed then as a tutor at Jews College, which was at that time the United Synagogue's rabbinical training school. And it had been promised that he would eventually be appointed as the principal of the college. When the time came to announce his appointment, though, the chief rabbi at the time, Chief Rabbi Brody, refused to honour that agreement to appoint him as principal, saying that his views on Revelation, as expressed in his book, were unacceptable. And Rabbi Louis Jacobs kind of recounts that obviously the chief rabbi had suddenly read the book. He hadn't read it previously, clearly. He'd suddenly read the book, because this was a few years later. And he'd come under pressure for more militantly orthodox factions, I think, within the Orthodox movement, to say that a person with these views about Revelation, that there's human content to the Torah, can't possibly be given a senior rabbinic appointment. So at that point, Rabbi Jacobs tried to return to the New West End Synagogue, but the United Synagogue vetoed his appointment there. So he was now left stranded without his appointment at the college, without his pulpit. And in protest at what the United Synagogue had done, the members of the New West End Synagogue resigned en masse and created a new synagogue, which was the New London Synagogue, which went on to become the first Masorti community. And that took place in 1964. So that's the story in a nutshell. And I recommend reading Rabbi Jacobs' autobiography, and Beyond Reasonable Doubt's a very good book as well. Anything that he wrote was very good, very readable, and very interesting. So all highly recommended. But what were the principles? The bit that interests me today is what were the principles behind Louis Jacobs' actions? And I want to reflect on these by reading something that he wrote from that same book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt. So I'm just going to share my screen for a second, and hopefully everyone can see this. Can everyone see that? Can everyone see that text? Yeah, great. So this is just a reflection that he wrote in the introduction to his book. So he says, if anyone had dared to set a paper for a yeshiva student, and here he's talking about a kind of, a traditional or ultra-Orthodox yeshiva. If anyone had dared to set a paper for a yeshiva student, asking him to discuss whether the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were historical figures, the only possible answer would have been to deny the relevance of the question. Of course, he would have vehemently retorted, the patriarchs were real historical figures, since they are so described in the Bible, which is the direct, infallible word of God, and upon which all our Jewish practices, ideas, and beliefs are based. What I had fondly hoped to promote, had I been appointed principal of the college, this is Jews College, within the circumscribed area of an Anglo-Jewish type of piety, was an atmosphere in which the students of the college were encouraged to face the problem courageously and try to deal with it honestly and constructively. I think those adjectives are really important. Adverbs. Those adverbs or adjectives? I don't know. I think they're adverbs actually. So I think those adverbs are really important. Out of the conviction that Judaism can meet the challenge of critical scholarship as it met the different challenge of Greek philosophy in the medieval period. Okay, and just to re-emphasize those words, honestly, courageously, honestly, and constructively, I think are really important words there. So those are some of Rabbi Louis Jacobs' reflections, and it seems to me that this position connects Masorti Judaism with the values of classical liberalism. So in classical 19th century liberalism, and by the way, not in the religious sphere, but classical political liberalism, as you might be familiar with, for example, from the works of John Stuart Mill, but also from earlier works, for example, the American Declaration of Independence or the American Constitution, or the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the French Revolution, other works which reflect classical liberalism. And one of the core values of liberalism is the value of free speech, unlimited by anything except the threat of direct physical harm to others that might result. I'll say it again. the value of free speech, which is unlimited by anything except the threat of direct physical harm to others. In other words, you should be able to say whatever you like, short of shouting fire in a crowded theatre. You know, that's the classic example of something you shouldn't be able to say because it's going to cause direct physical harm to other people. But we could extend that. For example, you know, another example could be the incitement of immediate violence. For example, if you imagine a speaker at an English Defence League rally in a Muslim neighbourhood, you know, where they speak, they whip up the crowd, and the crowd then goes off and attacks people. So that would be an example of speech that liberalism wouldn't condone, and say that we need to stop because there's direct physical harm that's going to come from it. But anything short of that, you should be able to say whatever you like, however offensive it is and however much people disagree with it. Okay, that's where we're up to so far. Now, that position, which was once very, very clear, I think, to most liberal-minded people, has become more problematic in recent years. And I was recently reading a very interesting book called How to Be a Liberal by the political journalist Ian Dunt, and he explains this very well. So I'm kind of go with his explanation. So he talks about how that liberal position on free speech has been complicated in recent years by the rise of identity politics. And he explains that identity politics assumes that what's important primarily is not your views as an individual, but your identity and experiences as a member of a group. For example, as a woman, as a person of color, as a Jew, as a gay person, right? So your group identity is what defines you more than your individual opinions. And members of marginalized, vulnerable groups, identity politics holds, need to be proactively included in society and protected because they're vulnerable and marginalized, because identity politics is very good at understanding power imbalances and power relationships. So we need to proactively include marginalized people. That means we need to ensure that they're not pushed out by statements or speech that makes them feel unsafe. And this is the origin, I think, of what we now call cancel culture. The idea that oppressive or offensive speech needs to be suppressed in the interests of equality and inclusion, okay? And that means that for people to kind of go along with that idea, it means that free speech is now can now be limited, not only if it risks physical violence, but also if it's likely to cause offense or clash with important values. So I'll give one example of that as it's affected our movement. So you may have seen a month or two ago, we hosted a meeting with the Israeli ambassador. Did anyone notice that event? So we hosted a meeting with the Israeli ambassador, and under normal circumstances, a meeting with the Israeli ambassador would be for us relatively uncontroversial. It's like meeting with a head of state. We're not thinking about their personal opinions. We're thinking about our kind of official relationship as a movement with the state of Israel, and we would obviously engage with the official representative of the state. Problem is that the current Israeli ambassador is also well, we could argue about how to characterize her, but I would characterize her as a far-right politician who has previously articulated racist views. And that complicated things, because then the question was, should we or shouldn't we invite her? And actually the Israeli embassy approached us, said would we like to meet with her, and we were then put in the position where we had to decide. And after much deliberation, the leadership of Masorti Judaism decided it's better to engage with the ambassador and to hold an event and to ask her some hard questions, and that's the right way to go. Our youth movement, Noam, took the opposite view and decided to boycott the event, and they held an alternative event where they looked at some different issues with some Palestinian speakers and human rights activists. And that debate between the leadership of Masorti Judaism and the leadership of Noam kind of summed up in our movement this tension around free speech and identity politics, between the view that you should be able to say anything and engage with any form of speech as long as it doesn't pose the risk of immediate violence or harm, as against the view that we should decide on which kinds of speech are suitable to be included based on offence that's likely to be caused, especially to marginalised groups, in pursuit of the values of equality and inclusion. I've tried to present the two positions fairly because I think there's merit in each of them. Now the final bit I'll just say is that we're left with, for us as a movement, I think we're. Oh, and by the way, I'm just going to add one last thing, which is that it seems to me that this clash between the value of free speech on the one hand and the principles of identity politics on the other hand are what underlies much of what we now call culture wars. And it seems that the left took up this idea of identity politics and creating safe spaces and censoring speech in order to achieve that. The right then protested out loudly in the cause of freedom of speech. And if you think about people like Toby Young or Lawrence Fox, right, talking about free speech all the time, but in fact, those same people in the government at the moment do exactly the same thing as the left, which is they try and kind of edit out views that they find unacceptable, right? So the left, in this sense, are kind of busy toppling statues of people involved in slavery because they don't think that should be part of the historical landscape. And the right are arguing that any charity or organization who does that should themselves be cancelled because that's illegitimate. So we've got this now debate between a left and a right who both seem to be part of this kind of cancel culture, both for good reasons, I guess, of their own. And free speech seems to have been left a bit neglected on the side. And the question I think we're left with as a movement is that we've got this clash between two values which are core to Masorti Judaism. So on the one hand, intellectual honesty and freedom of expression, which is what we inherited from Rabbi Louis Jacobs and the Enlightenment and liberalism. And on the other hand, the values of inclusion, welcome, and equality, which tend in the current climate to limit freedom of speech. And now what do we do? And the question, I suppose, of this, that's very interesting. Sarah's just popped up next to Claire, that's very funny. And I think in the context of this session, the question that we want to ask, and I'm now going to hand over to Rabbi Roni to explore this question a bit more, is how can our tradition help us resolve that tension? And we'll see if it can. So at this point, if anyone would like to say or ask anything at this point, we can do that. You can put a hand up or whatever, and we can call on you. And once we've done that, we'll hand over to Rabbi Roni. So would anyone like to make a brief comment or ask a question at this point? So I think we'll hand over to Rabbi Roni. Thanks, Roni. Oh, sorry, Karen, yes. A brief comment or question, Karen.
I just wanted to say, to raise the point about what you were saying, and I've probably lost it a bit because of brain fog. But seriously, about Jewish identity, how you see your identity, do you see it as basically a thing to do with law, halakha in inverted commas, religion as a belief in God and only that, full stop, and an identity whereby you are a human being that has a belief that includes spirituality, humanity, and some of the other adjectives that go on after that are similar, and how to incorporate all of it. And one assumes that Masorti, and because of Rabbi Jacobs, would have included all of that. And if it has, how do we promote it? How to comprehend it? How to dictate it or infer it?
Yeah. Okay.
And all the rest.
Great. Thank you, Karen. So that's a really, really broad, all-encompassing question about the nature of Judaism and how Masorti understands it. So I'm not going to try and answer that on one. I'm not going to try and answer that on one foot. But maybe what we'll do, let's go to Rabbi Roni. We'll hear Rabbi Roni's the teachings that you're going to bring, Roni, and then maybe we'll see if we can glean any insights on Karen's question as we go through that.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Very interesting introduction. I'm going to try not to just talk about what you said and talk about what I was planning to say. So I want to focus in on the question of within a community in particular, how do we handle disagreement and debates? I want to frame it around the idea of mahloket leshem shamayim, disagreement for the sake of heaven. So, I'm a rabbi, I like texts. So I'm going to put a source sheet in the chat. You're welcome to look at it yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to share it on the screen, so you don't need to look at it. I can put it up here using the wonderful resource of Safaria. If you don't know it, it's a wonderful thing to be on. And there's not very many of us. So if you would like to ask a question, if I say something's not clear, if you'd like to get some clarification or make a point, then do put it in the chat. Raise a virtual hand. I can't see everybody so easily, so raise a virtual hand if you can, and I'll try and call on you. But I think there's some real questions here about how much difference within our communities can we tolerate? right? What are the limits within our communities? And I think that all of us, if we were to think about our community, we would easily be able to think about disagreements within the community that we could easily tolerate. We can easily tolerate, a facetious example, we can easily tolerate people who like different Adon Olam tunes, right? Sarah's not sure. We can easily tolerate people who like different Adon Olam tunes. I think actually in the Masorti movement, we can fairly easily tolerate people who, thinking about Karen's point about what does it mean to be Jewish. We can pretty much tolerate people who believe in God and people who don't believe in God. Actually, that's a difference that we can absorb within Masorti, and there's all kinds of interesting things that we have figured out how to absorb. There are obviously differences that we would not be able to absorb. We could not accommodate, I think, a Messianic Jew, somebody who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, right? I think that it's an easy line because it's so obvious that we couldn't tolerate that within our community. So the question is, how do we tolerate, when there are more pointed disagreements, really difficult, painful ones, how do we recognize what is a tolerable disagreement and an intolerable disagreement where we have to resolve it one way or the other? And to kind of get us started, I want to look at Pirkei Avot. This is a teaching from the Mishnah, compiled about the year 200, and it's a section of wise sayings. And this teaching is well known. You've never looked at it before. Every dispute, every mahloket, every disagreement that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure. But one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Typically terse. The question is, well, what is for the sake of heaven? And what does it mean, will in the end endure? Right? What are those two things? Well, they're going to give us some examples, so perhaps this will be helpful. Which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? What's an example of that? The controversy, the debate between Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were two early sages. Before there were rabbis, there was Hillel and Shammai. They're proto-rabbis. And they disagreed vehemently about many things, and their two schools continued to disagree down the ages. And they disagreed about some really important things, including things like, what makes you a Jew? It's such that you could be a Jew under the eyes of one of their schools, but not under the other one. Right? So they're quite important categories that they disagreed with. And which is a controversy that's not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and all his congregation. We read the story of Korach recently in synagogue, a dispute of Korach rebelling against Moses and Aaron and saying, why are you lording it over the people? Aren't we all holy? Anyone have a read of this text of what's the good kind of disagreement that we like? Right, that's kind of a simplistic take here, but what's the good kind of disagreement that we like, and what's the bad kind of disagreement that we don't like? Does anyone have a kind of gut feeling of that?
Maybe a good disagreement is arguing about Torah for the sake of clarifying Torah and making sure we do it right. So like argument for the sake of mitzvot.
Yes, or for the sake of, so there's a few ways of reading that. One could be for the sake of truth, right? The dispute between Hillel and Shammai is they're trying to aim for the right thing, like the right meaning of Torah so that we do the mitzvot right. Another way of reading it could be that they're trying to aim for the good reading of Torah, so that we're trying to do Torah well.
How
Torah...
about the sake of rationality?
Sorry, hold on a second, Karen, just in the middle of speaking. Another way of reading it could be that we're trying to do Torah well, i.e. we're trying to do it in a moral way, right? Make sure that we're doing it in a way that doesn't hurt people, right? Those could be two different ways of trying to say that they're both aiming for Torah. But I think the core of that answer is they're aiming for Torah, and then by contrast, perhaps Korach is aiming for himself and his own benefit. And I think it's important that Korach, his opponent, is not listed in that line. It's not Korach and Moses, because it isn't really a dispute between Korach and Moses. It's Korach attacking Moses. Kara, now I'm ready to take your point.
No, it's what you said, but it's a question of The argument between Hillel and Shammai is a question on how you perceive rationality. Yes, it is to do with values, ethics, and all the rest. But they had different ways. If I can't remember the story, but they have different ways of looking at things. But the outcome, whatever way you look at it, should be of rationality. And Torah, we grow up believing that the Torah is a rational thing. But there's a Hillel Shammai question there as to which way you're looking at it. And then I leave the rest to you.
There's definitely one read of this text here, which is to say that the dispute of Hillel and Shammai is within tradition, right? That there are circumscribed limits to debate within which you can have, and that the Korach dispute is outside of that, right? That what's a disagreement that's not for the sake of heaven, it's one that doesn't come from within the system itself, but comes to attack the system and to destroy it. I mean, I don't personally like that reading that much because it doesn't. I do think, I'm in the Louis Jacobs school of kind of critically thinking about things, and that it's okay to take questions from outside the system. But I do think that it's not talking about what they disagreed about, but kind of their mode of disagreement. And this kind of sense of they're aiming for something better and bigger than themselves is, to me, really important. They're aiming for something bigger and better than themselves. It's not about the substance of their debate. If you read Korah, he says, isn't everybody in Israel holy? But the rabbis, I think, are saying that it's not about what he said, it's about why he said it. Is he aiming for the truth and the betterment of all the Israelite people? Or is he aiming for self-aggrandizement? Is he aiming for power he's aiming to put himself in Moses' place. Matt, you've put your hand up. Thank you.
I did. I think Barney had a hand up earlier. I don't know if Barney still wants to add.
Yeah, I mean, am I unmuted? Yes. I just think the substance of any debate has to be with goodwill, doesn't it? To come to an agreement, or to settle a matter, not to knock one down.
Yes, I think that's
not to win.
That's I think a lot of what's going on here. That the argument for the sake of heaven is one which is done with goodwill, aiming not to win but to get the best answer, whether that's the most true or the most kind. And actually, the debate between Hillel and Shammai might be a debate about whether you should aim for the true or the kind. It could be that Shammai is aiming for truth and Hillel is aiming for kindness. That's a debate for another time. But you have to come with it for the spirit of goodwill, but you also have to think that your opponent is coming to it with a spirit of goodwill. You have to both be entering it into the spirit of goodwill and trust that they are as well, and trust that you're in a real relationship with them such that you can safely disagree and still be in relationship at the end of it.
Ronnie, can I just add something? I was wondering if the clue is in the thing about Sofal Hit Kayem. Its end is it will or won't endure. And I was wondering if we can read it the other way, which is to say that the mark of a debate which is for the sake of heaven is that it does endure. In other words, if we see that the debate endures, like there's no right answer and it keeps going and going and going, then we can know the debate was for the sake of heaven. But if we can see that someone wins the debate and it's resolved, then we can know it wasn't for the sake of heaven.
The problem with that is that, as the next text is going to say, Hillel wins. Right. So in a way, the dispute doesn't continue. And in the same way we continue to read about Hillel and Shammai, we continue to read about Korach. So the dispute is still there. There's always going to be Korach. So I don't know. I'm not sure I buy it. I've, of course, brought too many texts, so we probably won't read them all. But it is interesting that the Talmud, the commentary on the Mishnah, when they talk about this idea that they disagreed with each other, they imagine that God speaks out from heaven, as it says here. Ultimately, a divine voice emerged and proclaimed, "Both these and these are the words of the living God." However, the halacha is in accordance with Beit Hillel. Right? So they're both right, says God, which is an amazing statement of truth in Judaism, that actually there can be two different readings which are both right, but we have to decide which way we're going to go. Right? That there becomes a limit in the community where we can't tolerate differences anymore. Actually, you're not allowed to act like Beit Shammai anymore, even though you're allowed to think like Beit Shammai. Right? You're allowed to think like Beit Shammai, but there comes a point where you can't act like Beit Shammai anymore. We've resolved that now. And now you have to follow Beit Hillel. And the Talmud says, why is it that we have to now follow Beit Hillel, right? Since both these and those are the words of the living God, why would Beit Hillel privileged to have the halacha, to have Jewish law established in accordance with their opinion? Is it because they were more right? No, says the Talmud, it's because they were agreeable and forbearing, right? They were kind, they got on well, they were generous, and they would teach their own statements and the statements of Beit Shammai. They didn't just teach their own opinion, they taught both opinions. And when they formulated their teachings, they always prioritized the statements of Beit Shammai to their own statements. And indeed, whenever you read a dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, you always read Beit Shammai first. Right? So in the end, they win not because they're more right or better at arguing, but because they were nicer, they were kinder, and they were more generous to their opponents. And I think there's something here about when you're making decisions, trying to follow the kinder way is, I think, important. Right? That it's not about being the most right, but are you being the most kind? And I do think that's Beit Hillel's MO all over. I'm going to read a bit more because I want to do take some more text, and I'll take another 2 minutes if I can. Rav Kook. I'm not an expert in Rav Kook, but I found this teaching and I thought it was very, very interesting. Just this bit here. He says, there are those who err thinking that world peace will not be built except by means of one form in points of view and qualities. Therefore, when they see students of Torah scholars inquiring into wisdom and the knowledge of Torah, and by means of their searching the perspectives and approaches multiply, they believe that they thus cause argument in the opposite of peace. Yet truthfully, this is not so. For the true peace cannot come into the world except by means of the value of a piece of many faces. A piece of many faces means that all sides and approaches are seen, and it becomes clear how there is a place for them all, each one according to its worth, its place, and its content. And on the contrary, all positions that appear superfluous or contradictory will be seen, once the truth of wisdom is revealed in all of her many-sidedness. For only by means of the coming together of all the parts, and all the details, and all of the views that seem different, and all of the divided branches, truly by their means the light of truth and righteousness will appear, along with the knowledge of God. And this, for me, is beautiful and really speaks to my sense of what truth is. Because in some of these most vehement and painful arguments, actually, when people really are arguing from a good place of good faith, there is truth in everything everybody's saying. There is value in what people are saying. And to be able to find the value in it and recognize that in the full picture of truth that no human being can hold, that truth has a place, right? As much as we may disagree with it and may feel it's painful, if it's from a real place of honesty and goodwill, that truth that that person is expressing has a place in the full picture of God's universe. And the real peace is not achieved by stamping all over people who disagree with you, but in trying to find a place for all the truth within that picture, which is a sort of a lofty goal, but I think kind of what Masorti is trying to get at. I'll just read this bit because I thought it was beautiful. A South African educator, Adina Roth, as I was preparing, I found this teaching. She writes, L'Shem Shamayim is an image that speaks of the infinite, an image that invites us to leap towards the heavens and consider the expanse of the universe. Defining it remains as subjective as interpreting the walls of water that escorted the Israelites from slavery to freedom. Some might argue that the definition is inflexible and that the Shem Shamayim is constituted through impermeable walls, arguments within a system whose rules are predetermined. But others might argue that L'Shem Shamayim can be any argument that advances the dignity of living beings, that speaks to the infinite possibilities of the universe, and that seeks to admit to our world and our communities the expanse of heavenly light. And I love this, picking up on the kind of beauty of the word Shamayim, right? That it's not for the sake of God, that there's something infinite and beautiful about aiming for the sake of heaven. I'll stop there. Thoughts, questions? Do I have time to take thoughts, questions, reflections?
I'll ask you a question, Ronnie, if that's all right.
Please.
And there'll be space for other people as well. I suppose my question is that you've celebrated very compellingly the value of diversity and difference in debate and encompassing lots of different opinions in the quest for truth. And what that leaves is the question of boundaries. Like, are there limits to that, and are there opinions which fall outside of that we shouldn't include? And I suppose the real conundrum is that we can't. One of the subjects of debate is which opinions should be left outside of the debate. So in other words, it's impossible to resolve that without having a debate sometimes about what opinions are illegitimate. And anyone, for example, who's tried to discuss, I don't know, trans issues or Israel and Palestine on the internet, for example, will know that that's a very difficult thing to achieve, to say the least. So I wonder if you've got any thoughts about that. Like, do these texts inform what the boundaries should be, or how we should go about setting boundaries?
Look, I think these are some of the most important questions of our time. My feeling is, first of all, I'm not in favor of everybody being able to say everything that they think all the time. Just getting back to your free speech point. I don't think that everybody should be able to say what they think all the time, or at least I value free speech in that I don't think the government should be able to arrest you for saying anything at any time. But I think wise people hold back. Wise people don't say everything they're thinking all the time, and kind communities don't let anybody say anything that they're thinking at any given point. Like, can we tolerate people in our community that have views that I think are hurtful and painful? I think I can tolerate them. Can I tolerate them expressing those views in painful ways in public? I'm not sure I can tolerate that. And then that's where I kind of lean towards, if in doubt, try and do the kindest thing, recognizing that there's lots of people with lots of kind of hurts, and especially in those two things you raised, sort of trans issues, Israel-Palestine questions, there's lots of pain and lots of hurt on all sides. So to really try and recognize the hurt and the suffering, and then try to make decisions when you can have different points of view. When it comes to action, try to choose kind choices. That's kind of my rule of thumb. Barney, you had your hand up again.
I think just what Matt was asking, I feel that it always has to come back to good faith, and it's a legal term that I heard recently, and I just thought it really summed up the solution to so much of this. And I think you mentioned two things, that much of the discussion is not had in good faith. It is arguments meant to look like debates, but that aren't. That they may be, something you'd call, a Mott and Bailey argument, in which you never get to the real issue because you always accuse the other person of some other sin, or you make an attack on that person's character, an ad hominem attack, or you lie. And you can't ever have a debate in good faith if you're doing any of those things. And many of these kind of thorny issues, I think, are had in bad faith. And you can always listen to a completely oppositional, opposing view, but you can never get anywhere if someone is deceitful, or for whatever reason, or is coming to the argument in bad faith.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the key to Hillel and Shammai is that they are in relationship with each other. They're in a community, and they're in a community that, in general, cares for each other and tries to look out for one another. And certainly a lot of trouble is stirred up by people who are politicians who are using things in order to try and win votes for themselves. There's a lot of that happening. But I think we were discussing some of these issues in our shul recently at a meeting we had. And one of the things we said is, before we tackle these really difficult issues, we need to remind everybody that we're all part of the same community and we care about each other. So let's first have we've been so separate over the course of the last 15 months when we've all been on Zoom. We haven't connected. Let's first really remind people why we're all in community together, why we like each other, why we care for one another. We don't actually have to like each other, but why we care for each other, right? That's important. And once we've remembered why we care for each other and all the things we share in common, then we can start debating from a place of care and relationship rather than from a place of attacking and aggression. Do I have time to take Karen's point before?
Yeah,
I'll take Karen's point.
I think a brief on Karen, and then we're going to move on to the last little bit.
Strangely enough, when you were talking, it reminded me of many years ago. It was on Hyde Park Corner, and there were a lot of police, and it was about Palestinians and Israelis. That's why I was there. And got talking to the police. When do they stop somebody? And as you said before about liberalism and about freedom of speech, when does it get to the point that you stop it? And you already answered, and it is about the incitement of violence. That free speech, people should be allowed to speak. Not everything is necessarily no, that didn't quite make sense. I was about to say not necessarily in the sake of the law. And it's a question of whether you interpret law as a halakha or legal law. But I also said before, and if you put it together, it's a question of how you look at each argument on whose it is and their point of view and what is rational. And basically, it's the same as you making a cake. You take a bit from here and a bit from there, you shake it up, and out comes a relatively complete thing.
I guess I'm arguing
that
there's a difference between what's legal and what's advisable, right? Not everything legal is a good idea. And also that two arguments can both be rational, but if we have to choose one, rationality is not going to help us make the best decision. And actually kindness is the way forward. I'm going to pass it over to Matt.
So thanks, Ronnie. So I'm going to share a couple more thoughts, and then Ronnie will have the last. Ronnie will have the last word. So get ready for some wisdom, Ronnie, at the end. It occurs to me actually from what we've been discussing that there's an interesting difference between Western liberalism and Judaism or halakha, and that's the difference of the emphasis between the Western liberal tradition emphasizes rights and Jewish tradition emphasizes obligations or duties. And that's a commonplace distinction, I think. But I think in this context, actually, it's quite important because it makes me think of the difference between the right to speak in a certain way and the obligation to listen in a certain way. And I was struck, actually, my thoughts went during that discussion to the fact that we're constantly occupied with who has the right to say what or who should be prevented from saying what. But we don't think ever, I actually have never heard anyone considering our obligations to listen or to hear. And it makes me wonder, what obligation do I have to hear things that make me uncomfortable, or that make me feel unsafe, or that I disagree with, or that I find offensive? And what obligations the vulnerable people have to hear things as well. So I think that's quite interesting, and that takes me in the direction of the last comment that I wanted to make. I'm going to share my screen again in a second, but it seems to me that we talk about speech all the time. I think we need to think more about listening and hearing. And that brings me in the direction of a final concept, which is the concept of dialogue. Because I think what we need to consider is, what form of dialogue do we want our community or our society to be marked by? Like, what kind of dialogue do we want to be engaged with? And dialogue is the combination of speaking and listening, obviously, and two people speaking or listening to each other. What kind of dialogue do we want that to be? So Ronnie's already kind of hinted that a very kind dialogue is what we're after. Other people think that dialogue should be about really trying to get to the truth with no holds bars. And I just want to share one last thing. So I'm going to share my screen one last time. I hope everyone can see that. Is that clear? Is that visible? Great. So this is from my philosophy of education background, not directly relevant, not directly Jewish, but I think really relevant. So there's this scholar of education called Nicholas Baboulis, and he says that he thinks about kinds of dialogue on two different scales, right? So he says one scale to think about is the difference between convergent dialogue and divergent dialogue. In other words, when we engage in dialogue with each other, are we trying to get to one answer? Like, are we trying to drive towards a consensus for one answer? Or are we happy for the dialogue to open up and lead to a multiplicity of different answers, right? So that's one question. And the second scale he uses is this scale of inclusive to critical. Inclusive dialogue is one where the priority is on hearing everyone's voice and making sure that everybody feels included. Whereas critical dialogue is one that really tries to question what the other people are saying and really get to the truth by questioning what they're saying. And he takes Baboulis takes those two scales, and he says that out of that you can construct this typology of 4 different kinds of dialogue. So he says that inclusive divergent dialogue, so dialogue which prioritizes hearing everyone's voice and isn't trying to get to one answer, he would call conversation. You know, everyone gets to talk, the priority is hearing what everyone has to say, we're not trying to get to an agreement, we're just trying to share what we all think. Conversation. Inclusive convergent dialogue, he calls inquiry. So this is, again, it's really important that we share what we all think, we hear each other's voices, everyone gets to participate, but we are trying to establish what's true and what isn't, and we're trying to do it together. That he calls inquiry, okay? Moving around the circle, convergent critical dialogue, Baboulis calls instruction, and he's thinking about a teaching context here, I think. But, you know, if dialogue is aiming at a particular answer, and what we're trying to do is attack each other's positions, criticize each other's positions in order to get to the truth, that's kind of a teaching mode, right? And you can imagine a kind of Socratic kind of teacher asking questions to the students in order to get them to think a certain way. There's nothing necessarily violent or manipulative about it, but it's about asking the difficult questions in order to get to a particular insight. And the 4th quadrant, which is critical divergent dialogue, so the emphasis being on really trying to critique what other people are saying, find the differences, see what the problems are, get underneath get into the problematics of what people are saying, and really focus on the ideas themselves, but respecting the fact that we're not going to agree with each other, that he calls debate. And I find that a really helpful model to understand the different kind of dialogues we can engage with. And I think actually, as I'll end the screen share. I think that's I don't know what the answer is. You know, I was thinking, can I plot on that chart where I think we should be as Masorti Jews? And the answer is I can't plot on the chart, because I think sometimes, depending on the issue and depending on the people and depending on the setting, we need to prioritize inclusion, and sometimes we need to prioritize critique. Sometimes we need to try to get to an answer, and sometimes we need to just respect the fact that we all differ from each other. But I think understanding that there are the different kinds of dialogue, I think, is a really helpful tool. And the fact of dialogue, I think, is especially important. I'll end with one sort of last thought that occurs to me, and then we'll come back to you, Ronnie, because I think that there's, you know, for me, there's something really important about dialogue, which is that it's looking another person in the face and really communicating with them. And for me, there's something very Jewish about that idea, and lots of Jewish philosophers have talked about this. So I think about people like Buber and Levinas, who really talked about this in philosophical terms, that act of really looking someone in the face and understanding that they are created in the image of God and they're of infinite value, to me seems to underpin this concept of dialogue. And I think that as Jews in general, but as Masorti Jews in particular, should be something that we bring with us. So I'll stop there, and I just want to come back for a last word before we see if anyone's got any last thoughts to Rabbi Roni. And I wonder if, you know, the last question I suggested, I've got no idea if you have an answer to this, Ronnie, but the question we were thinking about is what do you think a distinctively Masorti approach to this question might be?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about lots of different things. I'm thinking about how much Louis Jacobs was interested in truth, and how relatively little I'm interested in truth. I don't feel like the purpose of of Masorti Judaism is to try to find the most true answers as we can. As much as I am a critic, and I do approach things from a historical, critical angle, and I try to understand things, what's true. I think I'm shocked by the number of people that seem to be so sure of themselves about things, about so many things. There's so many people on the internet, and maybe this is just the way the internet makes you act, but the internet just seems to be full of people who are certain that they're right about everything. And I don't know how people can be so sure that they're right all the time. I live my life constantly in doubt that I've made good decisions and that my beliefs are correct. So I'm still thinking. So I think we could do with a few more people being less sure that they're right. And I think that if being a bit less sure you're right can help you engage in real, honest debate with other people from a perspective of we're trying to get to something good at the end of it, not necessarily right at the end of it, then being less sure that you're right, if everybody can be a bit less sure you're right, I think we'd get somewhere a bit helpfully. I'm thinking of Louis Jacobs' courageously, honestly, and constructively as a way of approaching discussions. Sometimes we need to make decisions. Sometimes I think in the Masorti movement we should have made decisions and we didn't. I wonder if we should have come up with a policy about streaming services that everybody was either going to do it or not do it on Shabbat or Yom Tov. Whereas actually what we've done is different people are doing different things, and I don't know if that was a good move on our part. Maybe it was. I don't think we can know yet. But in general, I think but I do think we were right to have that kind of both opinions on the Israeli ambassador, actually. So I don't know if I've got a wise words. I think sometimes we should be making firm decisions and don't. I think it's interesting that the Talmud does come down eventually saying, no, we've closed it off now. Beit Shammai is no longer acceptable. You can't act that way. And in fact, if you do, says the Talmud elsewhere, you deserve the death penalty, which is just to say, don't do that. And we're very bad at actually closing off doors. So I think sometimes we should be doing that, and we're not. But in general, I do believe that holding on to different truths that people hold is a creative act. That in the same way that in the mystical view of creation, in the beginning everything was God, and that didn't allow anything to exist. In order for there to be existence, God has to retract tzimtzum to create a space where there is not God, where there is difference and disagreement and things are messy, in order for anything to be created. And I do believe that disagreement and difference is necessary for creation, and I think that's true in our movement as well.
Great, thank you. I think just before we stop, some of us have had a chance to say things. I just wanted to offer Claire, Sarah, or Geraldine, or Martha, actually, for that matter, if you've got any final thoughts. Would you like to share anything? Just those of us.
Akila is here as well. Akila says so.
Oh, sorry, I can't see. Yeah, yeah, and Akila as well. So if anyone who hasn't spoken yet would like to share something, please do. Claire. Sorry, Sarah. I'm just looking at the name. It says Claire, and I can see it's Sarah, but I can see the name Claire underneath. So I said Claire. Go ahead, Sarah.
I don't have any questions or statements, but I have 3 things which I'm playing with in my head, which I'll now play with out loud, and maybe someone can make things make sense to me. The first is, I wonder what sometimes there's a role within a religious movement for like a beit din to make a decision on something one way or another, because sometimes we recognize that we, the lay people of the community, say, are not wise enough or are not whatever enough to make decisions that pertain to Jewish practice or to community practice. And I wonder, firstly, like when there's a role for that, and when there has been a role for that within the Masorti movement before. Secondly, what do we do when the other half of the argument don't want to listen? What do you do if you say, tell me your thoughts, educate me on this thing that we disagree on, and they say, no, I don't want to, for whatever reason. I don't have time, I'm too busy, you're just wrong, I don't think I'm going to change your mind. And then the third is about like hard lines. I'm sure there are some things where if you know, if we said, oh, you know, race is a difficult issue, like I personally, you know, which obviously isn't the case, I personally don't think a person of color should come to our shul. Like that would just be a thing that is completely wrong. And I would like to think that the Masorti movement would not tolerate that person as a member of the shul. But there are other things where it's not so clear cut, and for, you know, one person that might be like a hard line where they don't want to be in community with that person, but for other people it's not. And what do we do with those issues? The end.
Ronnie, would you like to respond? I can't say. Would you like to respond to any of those things, Ronnie? Don't have to. Tough questions.
Yes, I'm with you. Those are good questions.
Great. Just on one of those points, Claire. Sorry, Sarah. I keep seeing the name Claire underneath, and I think I can say that. I say it's like you're wearing a name badge, Sarah. Sorry, Sarah. Just on the first question you raised, which is about are there times when the rabbinic body of our movement makes a hard and fast decision. In the UK, we've been very kind of unstructured around that by and large. Occasionally, I think the rabbis tried to make a hard decision around streaming on Shabbat, for example, and it didn't really hold because, well, it didn't quite hold.
The decisions we make are to allow people to do things. Right. So we've permitted, the two major ones in the time I've been a rabbi is we permitted people to do streaming on Yom Tov, and we permitted people to do same-sex weddings. Right, those are the two major things we did discuss and permitted. Now what we don't do is say, now everybody has to. Right, you were still, I don't think anybody is in that category, but you were still permitted not to do same-sex weddings when we allowed it. You were still permitted not to stream on Shabbat when we allowed it. Right, anyway.
Right. And what I was going to go on to say, by the way, is that in Israel and the United States, when there's a much clearer sort of procedure for these things, even in those larger rabbinic assemblies, so when the Israeli Vad Halacha makes rulings, for example, or when the American Committee on Jewish Law and Standards makes rulings, they usually produce a majority opinion and at least one minority opinion, and usually more than one, and sometimes more than one majority opinion. And those halachic rulings then become resources for local community rabbis to make their own decisions. So it's really not in the ethos of our movement to make very clear decisions, apart from on tight, you know, very, very few issues. So I think it's actually the DNA of our movement to really, really avoid being univocal and prescriptive. That's my understanding of it. Who else would? So Akila or Claire or Geraldine, would any of you like to add anything? So I have a motorbike going past my window. If you can hear the noise.
Sorry, I'm actually on call for work, so I came in like halfway, and I was like half listening because I got paged a few times. But
nice to meet you anyway. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I totally agree with someone was talking about Israel Palestine earlier, and I like in the last conflict, the last few months, I was seeing that in my own like friend group on social media. I have some Palestinian friends, but I mostly have like Jewish friends who are mostly pro-Israel. So it's really interesting seeing, and like non-Jewish, non-Palestinian friends posting on social media too. And I know the history pretty well because I love reading about the history and I love hearing perspectives, and I try to remain as unbiased as possible. It took a long time to get there, but it was really frustrating to see like how many people had just like this ego around being right, and how many people, like most people could not, they didn't have like the info to understand what was like actually factually correct and what wasn't. And there was one really frustrating, actually a former flatmate of mine from uni, posted Biden's tweet saying that she posted that Biden's tweet saying Israel has a right to defend itself, which I think Israel does. And she said that Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself as the aggressor, but she's like lived in California her whole life. She has no connection to this conflict whatsoever. And I said something and I was like, I have friends a few of my friends were 300 feet away from a rocket. And I empathize with Palestinians and I empathize with Israelis, but it's just this, she didn't say anything. And it's just so easy for people to forget that we're all human, right? And that's what I found so frustrating, is that people are so, like, I think with liberalism, it's like the authoritarian left, right? Like, I think the authoritarian left, and I identify as left, but not authoritarian, they claim to care about human lives, but when it comes to Israel-Palestine, they're like, oh, it's okay for Israel to get attacked. No, it's not okay. It's like, it's a war on both sides, right? I think there's an obvious upper hand that Israel has, but just seeing how people were putting their own ego into something that may not ever affect them was just really frustrating.
Thank you, Akila. I think that's a really important insight. Thank you for sharing that. Geraldine, I think we'll come to you for the last comment. Oh, and we've got Claire now as well. Good. Geraldine and then Claire for the last comment.
I just wanted to say that everybody is their own truth, but we've got to understand that in saying that, everybody's truth can be different, but we just have to try and be kind and be inclusive. And the more we try and be kind and be inclusive, the more our truths will be equal and be shared out between everybody. So we can embrace all our life experiences from different points of view, but come to a central agreement on what that is. And as long as it's kind and humanitarian, and we all have empathy for each other, we find that everybody's truth is different, but also equally relevant, as long as it's kind and humanitarian. And that's what I wanted to say. That I was primarily agreeing with you guys.
I always think, you can have a community of everybody who agrees with you as long as you're to do community by yourself.
Yeah.
And once you've got more people, then you're going to have more. Then you're going to have to manage this stuff, because you cannot have a community of more than one person.
But that's what makes it more beautiful.
Exactly.
Thank you. I'll just interject. I'm always, following what Akila and what Geraldine said, I'm always shocked by so many people's incapacity to hold more than one, to hold seemingly contradictory ideas in their heads at the same time and understand that there's more than one way of looking at things. I find it absolutely shocking the extent to which people are unable to do that. And I wonder if there's something in our values as a movement, which is that's exactly what we're trying to promote on the back of Jewish tradition. And I mean, it's not uncomplicated. It's not difficult. It's very difficult to do that, I think, and to find the correct boundaries to that. But it seems to me that that's what we're wrestling with all the time. And maybe that's why I like the Masorti movement so much, actually. Last but not least, Claire.
I'm not really sure it's a formed thought yet, but I think I'm going back to what Roni said about, particularly for our community, how we need to bring the community together first to reconnect as a community before we start tackling these issues. And I guess my thought is, what do we do when people aren't joining the community, or hypothetically people are feeling excluded from joining a community in the first place because people are holding views that are delegitimizing their personal lived experiences, or are just making it an unwelcoming space to even start having a community setting before even tackling these issues if they're excluded by people's speech and by people's opinions straight out.
So I can see that Roni doesn't respond to that. I think I've got one little thought, and then we'll stop. My thought is that, and maybe this is a challenge which comes out of what you're saying, Claire. The challenge is the intensely subjective nature of that question, and the fact that one person feeling shut out because of someone else voicing their opinions, the flip side of that is going to be the first person feeling marginalized if you don't let them express their opinions. And the question always, I think it's that intensely subjective, or is it intersubjective nature of this means it's really hard to, you end up in this rabbit hole of only being able to debate what you're allowed to debate. And it's very hard to find I think it's very hard to find a clear answer to that on the level of the content. And maybe we're just throwing back on what Geraldine and what Roni and what some others were saying, which is it has to be about the attitude that we bring. And are we listening in the right way? Are we engaging in dialogue? Are we being kind? Are we being patient? So maybe there's something about the kind of character or the virtues in sort of classical language that we want to develop, rather than being about what we can say and what we can't say. And I wonder if maybe that's a more fruitful way of approaching it, just sort of based on this discussion. that was a final last improvised thought. So thank you for indulging me. I would like to thank Rabbi Roni for planning and teaching this session with me. And I would like to thank Martha for helping put it together, and to thank everyone for coming. It was nice to see you all. And yes, please, as Martha says, please join us on Sunday at 7 p.m. for a really interesting session, very pertinent to this actually, on Israel, on coexistence between Jews and Palestinians within Israel. And we've got some really interesting speakers coming from East and West Jerusalem and from the Galil, activists on the ground. So please do join us for that. Thank you, everyone.